demands, as we all know, evolving technological advancements, evolving stakeholders' expectations, it is imperative that the internal audit function operates as a strategic business partner in ensuring that organizations meet these critical objectives and maintain their competitive advantage. Now, this webinar is particularly timely as we delve into the recent revisions to the global internal audit standards. These standards are at the cornerstone of our profession, and the changes to the standards go beyond procedural updates. Indeed, they represent a fundamental shift in how we as internal auditors must approach our work, enhancing the way we think, operate, and create value for our organizations. As we embark on this process of learning and the implementation of these new standards, I encourage every one of you to be an active participant in today's session. I need you to ask questions. I need you to share feedback from your experiences. And most importantly, think critically about how these changes will impact your organization. Our success lies not just in accepting these revised standards, but in their effective implementation to drive positive change. Finally, I would like to thank you all for being present today. It is our commitment, to lifelong learning and professional excellence that drives the future of our profession. So together, we must have this commitment as a critical thing that we do on a day-to-day basis. I'm confident that by the time this session is concluded, we will all be better equipped to meet the future needs of internal audit with the necessary and required vision, confidence, and agility. Welcome. Let's begin. Thank you. Over to you, Favor.
Thank you so much, Bimpe, for that opening remark, and thank you for setting the tone for today's webinar. And just as Bimpe has said, please keep an open mindset. Let's take the key learnings so that we can drive value even as we go back to our various organizations. Our next speaker today is Elizabeth Kwateng. Elizabeth is a senior manager in the governance, risk and compliance practice of KPMG in Ghana. Today, Elizabeth will be providing us an overview of the new internal audit standards. She's going to be discussing why the standards were revised, and she's going to be highlighting the key principles behind the changes. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Kwateng. Elizabeth, over to you.
Good morning, Favor. Good morning, everyone on call. Thank you, Bimpe, for setting the tone for this morning conversation. Right, so I would touch briefly on the introduction to the standards and then also walk you through the key changes that we have seen moving from the 2017 standard to the 2024 one. Now, before the publication of this new standard, it had to go through some rigorous processes. So before it released in 2024, there were a period of 2 years where there was research and then benchmarking from 2019 to 2022. And this research and benchmark had to consider input from diverse groups of people. And let me give you some statistics. So there was about 1,612 surveys from about 135 countries. And that also included about 140 internal audit leaders across the globe. And then groups that also gave their input. And some of these groups included the Big Four, the Basel Committee of Banking Supervision, the World Bank, the IMF, and other reputable institutions. And that goes to tell you the amount of work and rigor that went into the development of this standard that is now applicable for us to be able to use as well. And bearing that in mind as well, it means that wherever we are across the globe, we could leverage the insights coming from this standard. And the 2024 standard I will walk you through the key changes, but for now, we are looking at the key components where we have about 5 key domains backed by 15 guiding principles and then 52 standards. So if you don't get anything at all within this period, bear in mind that this is how it is structured. And when you pick each of the 52 standards, there are requirements. And what this requirement seeks to achieve is that it tells you what is expected. Let's go back to the previous slide. It tells you what is expected. And then it also gives you room or some considerations for you to implement these requirements. And then more importantly, as auditors, whenever we go out to do our audit, we ask for demonstrative evidence. So whenever you say you have implemented any of the standards, then the next question is, what is your evidence? So it gives you examples of evidence of conformance as well. Now, in terms of the structure of the global standards as well, it gives you some fundamentals, and that fundamentals gives you the applicability of the standards. Now, this standard is applicable to all organizations that provide internal audit services to their organization. It also applies to the internal auditors themselves, irrespective of the size, the sector, and even the complexity as well. What that means is that whether you are profit-making organization or non-profit-making organization, this is still applicable to you. Then again, if your internal audit is even outsourced, this standard is applicable to you, as well as internal auditors that are being sourced in-house as well. It also gives you some indications as to how we can apply this standard within the public sector. And I know that even for us in Ghana, the Internal Audit Agency, which is the regulatory body for the internal auditors within the public sector, has adopted these standards and is making a lot of tweaks and changes to the manuals that will guide internal auditing within the public sector in Ghana. And I believe other countries have also adopted this as well, and it is working accordingly. Then when you look at the standard as well, we have the mandatory ones, which is the standard itself. And then there's what we call the topical requirement. So the topical requirement enhances consistency in internal audit services when you pick a specific audit to do. For example, if you are doing a cybersecurity audit, there's a topical requirement for cybersecurity that has been published. What is currently ongoing that has been issued as an exposure draft is third-party risk management. And that exposure draft is open from now till the 20th of April for input from the general public. So if you are here, this is an opportunity for you to provide some input into standard that will be used across the globe as well. Then the third aspect of the standard has to do with the global guidance. So here they are non-mandatory information or advice, as well as best practices that you can provide for you in terms of the step-by-step things you need to execute when you are doing your work. And that also includes the engagement planning, performance, communication, sustainability, financial services, and then as well as public sector. For how the standard has also been outlined, as I indicated, there are 5 domains, 15 principles, and then 52 standards. The domain 1 has to do with the purpose of internal auditing. And here you can see that it's more like the elevator pitch of our profession. When somebody asks you as an internal auditor, what do you do? Or what is your value? Then you can be bold enough to say that we strengthen the organization's ability to create. That is 1. We also protect and then sustain value by providing the board and then senior management with independent, risk-based, and then objective assurance, advice, insight, foresight. For domain 1, there are no principles and there are no standards. And this is applicable to all our stakeholders, as well as us internal auditors. When you pick domain 2, it gives you the characteristics we must exhibit as internal auditors in the execution of our work. And for that one, we have 5 principles and then backed by 13 standards as well. For domain 3, it gives room for our stakeholders, which is the board and senior management, to set the tone, to set the right environment for us to be able to achieve our mandate as internal auditors. You would bear with me that if we do not have the right environment, we can do all the work required of us, and then our recommendations would gather dust on the shelf, and we do not want that. So domain 3 gives the responsibility to the chief audit executives to provide the information required by the board and senior management for their effective oversight responsibilities. And as we go through today's conversation, you will know what is expected for our board of directors as well. For domain 3, we have 3 principles backed by 9 standards as well. Domain 4, we have 4 principles backed by 16 standards. For domain 4, it is the responsibility of the chief audit executives to put on the cap of more like a CEO to steer the affairs of the internal audit function. And that includes developing the strategy, having the right skill sets on board, making sure that his team members that he's training are retained as well, because if you train and they leave, how do you sustain the value you bring to the table? So it gives a lot of insight to the chief audit executives to be able to put on his cap and then
Hello, everyone. It appears Elizabeth is having network issues.
Moving on.
Okay, she's back on now.
Eva, can you hear me?
Elizabeth, we stopped hearing you for a while.
Wow. For how long? Because how long ago? Because I've been talking for some time. But I was giving an overview of the 5 domains and the definitive principles, giving room for us to know what is expected of the key stakeholders. So when I said domain 1, what we are saying is that it pertains to all our stakeholders as well as us internal auditors. It gives us room to pitch our profession to our stakeholders for them to know the value we bring to the table. And that value includes how we strengthen the organization's ability to create, protect, and then sustain value. For domain 2, with 5 principles and 13 standards, it gives us the characteristics we must exhibit as internal auditors as we execute our responsibilities. Domain 3 gives the head of audit or the CAE the information or the responsibility for him to bring the board of directors and even senior management on board so that they can support the function of the internal auditors. Because if you do not have the right environment, all the work we do will not see the value required. Domain 5 is applicable to all internal auditors, and it has 3 principles with 14 standards. And then I added the fact that considering that we have 52 standards, we won't be able to go through all in this webinar. We will touch on about 26 of them, and then it gives room for all of us here on the call to do much study on the rest of the standards. Favor, am I still audible?
Yes, you are, Elizabeth.
Great, great. So moving on, we would touch on the key changes from the 2017 IPPF to the 2024 one as well. Next slide, please. Okay. Right, so I'll touch on the key changes from the 2017 where we are now. And as I indicated, the new standards were published on the 9th of January 2024. And there was a 12-month period within which institutions were supposed to implement. Within this transition period, the 2017 standard were still applicable. But now that we are in 2025, we are going strictly by the 2024 standards. Now, there are two key categories of changes from the 2017 to the 2024 one. And these are the structural changes as well as the key content changes. When you pick the structural changes, you will notice that moving from the 2017 one to the 2024, all the standards have been combined into one document. So when you pick the mission of internal audit, the definition, the 10 core principles, the code of ethics, and then the standards, which were categorized into the attributes and then the performance standard, they are all in one document now. So now we don't have separate documents. And that makes it a bit easier for you to navigate across the document. Then again, there are other recommended but non-mandatory elements, which is the implementation guidance and then the practice guide has also been infused into the standard as well. The second structural change had to do with the fact that the standards are no more divided into attribute and then performance standard category. And did not also contain the interpretation, because when you pick the old one, there was the requirement and then it gives you some interpretation so that there is no ambiguity, but now that has been infused as well. And then there was the denomination of an A to show an assurance or a C to show consulting during the implementation standard as well. But now that has also been embedded into the main standard as well. And then the third one, which I also mentioned, was that now the numbering has also changed. We used to have the 1000 series, the 2000 series in the old standards, but now we have the 5 domains and the 15 principles and the 52 standard, with each of the standards having, let's say, 2 digits as well, whether 5.2, 10.1, or 10.3. But the previous one, we had about 1000, which shows the documentation of the authority, the responsibility of the internal audit. So it's now clearly defined as well. So these are the structural changes that have happened within the new standard. We move on to the key content changes. Right, so there are 5 key content changes moving from the 2017 to the 2024. And the first one had to do with the essential conditions for the board and then the senior management, which is contained within the domain 3. So please put a pin on that. We will go into a big granular for you to understand what I'm talking about if you are new to the standard. So standard 6.1 to 8.4 gives the essential conditions. And these essential conditions is more like the favorable environment that the board and senior management can offer internal auditors so that the work we do can see the light of day. And as I indicated, if you do all the work and we don't get the support, our recommendations will be on the shelf and to gather dust, and we do not want that. So that essential conditions is more like the favorable environment within which, if you are using the baking analogy, it is the environment that the yeast, which has been added to the flour, could rise as well for us, for our baking to really have the effect that we need. The second content change is the internal audit strategy. It is now a requirement for all internal audit functions to have a strategy in place, and that is mandated by Standard 9.2. It was not a requirement under the old standard, but now you need a strategy in addition to your internal audit plan that we all know we develop as we go through our risk assessment. The third content change has to do with integrated assurance and then the internal audit plan, backed by Standard 9.4 and the 9.5. So it is now a requirement for you to collaborate with both your internal assurance providers as well as external assurance providers. And then the standard gives you some approaches for you to adopt, whether you are using the assurance maps or the combined assurance approach. It is now a requirement for you to collaborate. Internal auditors, we cannot work in silos again. Independence does not mean isolation. We must work hand in hand with all our stakeholders, our internal assurance providers and other external assurance providers, to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts. And then we're also covering all the key risk areas within our organization. So it is now a requirement. The fourth content change has to do with reports and then findings rating. Now we need to conclude on our engagement. And that engagement conclusion, you as an internal auditor, you put on the cap of you put on your professional judgment, and then you look at all the findings collectively and then rate it whether it's satisfactory or unsatisfactory as well. So now you need to do that as part of your reporting. The fifth one, but not the least, has to do with the enhanced requirements for external quality assessment. As we all know, for external quality assessment, it must be activated at least once every 5 years, where there is an objective or independent assessment of the internal audit function. And the purpose is to be able to ensure that internal audit function is complying with the standard, it is meeting its performance objective, and is also complying with laws and regulations as it requires. Now, the requirement is that at least one of the team of assessors must have an active CIA certification. So this is a point that internal audit executives must take note to say that if you are bringing on board any consultant for external quality assessment, make sure that at least one of the team has an active CI certification. And what we mean by active CI certification is that I could have written the CIA exams in 2018, but from 2018 to 2025, I have not gone through the CPD requirement for my CIA to be active. What that means is that I'm not qualified to be in the assessment team if I'm going to be used as the one with the CIA qualification. So these are some of the changes going through. And as we walk through the presentation, you will notice and connect all the dots. That brings me to my session. What have I walked us through? I've walked us through the evolution of the IPPF to the 2024 standard. I've also walked us through the key changes, and that included the structural changes as well as the key content changes moving from the 2017 to the 2024 standard. And as we go through, I would also mention.
Hi, Elizabeth. It appears our slides are not moving. Mohammed, please, can you help project the slides that Elizabeth is speaking to?
Some of the learnings immediately. And the full-blown standard, which is 120
Okay, it appears Elizabeth is glitching. Mohammed, please, can you help us reproject the slides? They are not moving. Okay, so that we do not waste further time, we'll move over to the next session. Up next, we would have Anthony and Frank come up. Anthony is an assistant manager in the Governance Risk and Compliance Services practice for Ghana. And Frank is a senior associate. Both Anthony and Frank will provide an overview of, would walk us through detailed changes to the standards, and what these changes mean for us as internal auditors. We sincerely apologize for the glitch we had from Elizabeth. Over to you, Anthony and Frank. Please take us through the significant changes to the standards and what these changes means for us as internal auditors. Over to you, Frank and Anthony.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Favor. Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you on this webinar. And today we are going to focus on what's really changed the new global internal audit standards, and more importantly, why it matters for you as audit professionals and leaders. I know many of you have been working with the old IPPF for years, so you are probably wondering what's different, what do I need to adjust, what's expected of me now. And that's what exactly what we'll be tackling today. We will look at where the significant changes are, what the new requirements are around things like implementation considerations and evidence of conformance, and how you can apply all that in practice, whether you are leading the function or delivering engagements on the ground. So we'll start with domain 2, ethics and professionalism, which sets out how we are expected to behave as internal auditors. And it replaces the old code of ethics and gives us a clear framework for the professional standards we need to live by. And it's not just for us as individuals, but for the entire internal audit functions, whether you are in-house or providing outsourced services, as Elizabeth mentioned. Now, when we talk about ethics and professionalism, there are 5 key principles. And for this section, I'll focus on some of the standards under 4 of those principles, because they tie directly into the most significant changes you need to know. So let's start with the first principle, which is demonstrate integrity. And this is the bedrock of who we are as internal auditors. Integrity is about honesty and moral courage. It's doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. And let's be honest, there are times when we are under pressure to do exactly that. But here's the thing: if we can't be trusted to hold the line, who can? So our integrity is what gives stakeholders confidence in our work, in our judgments, and in the role we play. Under this principle, we focus on 2 key standards. That's standard 1.1, honesty and professional courage, which lays out expectations around telling the truth and standing firm, even in tough situations. And standard 1.2, organization's ethical expectation, which focuses on how internal auditors help shape and supports an ethical culture across the organization. So now let's get into what standard 1.1 is really about: honesty and professional courage. And from there, we'll move into the other standards where the changes are real game changers. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, right? We have always had integrity in internal audit, and that's nothing new. And you're absolutely right, right? Integrity has always been a core principle for us. It's been in the IPPF Code of Ethics since 2017. Every induction, every policy manual, you will find it there. But here's the shift, right? The new standards take that principle of integrity and expand it. They make it clear that it's not enough to have integrity, right? You have to act on it, especially when it is difficult. And that's where professional courage comes in. In the past, we've always talked about being objective, independent, and honest, and those things are still fundamental, and they are not going anywhere. But think about it for a moment. You can be honest, right, and still stay silent. You can be objective and still avoid difficult conversation. And let's be honest, we've all been there, haven't we? Yes. And you spot something, but you hesitate. You think is it worth it? Am I going to be supported if I bring this up? Will I be labeled difficult for raising this? And these are real life situations. So what the new standard says is that you are required to speak up, especially when it's uncomfortable. You're expected to communicate truthfully, even when the message won't be well received, and you have to take action when the stakes are high. As an internal auditor, you are expected to be truthful, accurate, and open in every professional relationship and communication, even when you are expressing skepticism, right? Even when you are offering an opposing viewpoint. And that can be uncomfortable sometimes. But here's the expectation: you don't have to hide. You don't have to omit findings because they are inconvenient, or hold back pertinent information because it can cause problems. You have to disclose all the material facts you are aware of, because if you don't, the organization can't make well informed decisions. Now, if you are leading an audit team, or if you are a chief audit executive, this takes a whole new meaning. It's not just about your personal courage. You are responsible for creating an environment where your auditors, internal auditors, feel safe to speak up, where they know they are supported, and where they know they won't be thrown under the bus for surfacing uncomfortable truths. And let's be clear, this isn't about bravery. It's about this isn't just about bravery, right? This is about leadership and about culture. Because if your internal auditors don't feel safe enough to speak up about a red flag, whether it's fraud, control failure, or non-compliance, that's not just an audit issue. That's a governance failure. And we know from experience, organizations rarely fail because auditors didn't see the risks. They fail because no one was willing or able to say what's needed to be said. So when we talk about professional courage, this isn't just about ethics, it's risk management. And for those of you in leadership, this is now a benchmark for how you are evaluated. And look, professional courage is easy to talk about in theory, but in practice, we all know how tricky it can be. So how do you build this muscle? Because professional courage isn't something you are born with. You need to develop it, and organizations need to invest in it. So that means investing in ethics training, but more than that, it means coaching, it means mentorship, it means supervisors and CAs leaning in and saying, let's work through this together. Yeah, here's how you approach this conversation respectfully, but firmly. Because the reality is, professional courage isn't just about being brave. It's not about marching into a room with fists clenched, right? It's about having the courage to speak up, but doing it with tact. It's about being respectful while still being clear. And you don't get good at that just by reading case studies. You get good at that through practice, through real conversations, through mentorship, supervision, and feedback, especially when the stakes are high. I had a situation once, right? One of our new team members picked up on an issue that frankly wasn't obvious at the first glance, right? There was a pattern in the data that didn't quite sit right, but they were hesitant. You could see it, and they weren't sure whether to flag it or to let it go. So I sat down with my teammates. We unpacked it together. I asked him, "What are you seeing? What's your instinct telling you?" And walked through how to raise it, who to approach, and how to frame it in a way that was respectful but didn't water down the concern. And they did it. They stepped up, and you know what? It turned out to be something the client needed to act on. That's how you build professional courage, not by telling people to be brave, but by showing them how, giving them tools, giving them the language, and giving them that support. And as CAs, that's chief audit executives, and as leaders, that's on us. We need to be available. We need to create those learning moments when we are reviewing work papers, when we are approving engagement scopes, when someone says, I'm not sure what to do here. Because when we do that, we build a team that stakeholders trust, and not because we tell them to, but because we consistently show up with honesty and professional courage. And if you are wondering how you evidence this, it's pretty straightforward. So you can do it through your training plans, where you include ethics education. You keep attendance records for the training, and you can also conduct performance evaluations to assess honesty and courage, and also obtain feedback from key stakeholders that demonstrates these values are in practice. Now, standard 1.2 is on organizations' ethical expectations. One of the things we often see in internal audit is that ethics starts at the top, right? The tone at the top. And while that's true, standard 1.2 reminds us that it also starts with us. us all as internal auditors. And as internal auditors, we have a responsibility not just to understand the organization's ethical expectations, but to meet them, to respect them, and to model them. And that's not always easy, especially when you're in rooms where difficult decisions are being made. But that's the job, right? You're in a position of trust, and the trust comes with accountability. Now, most organizations have these expectations set out really clearly. They've got a code of ethics, a code of conduct, policies on professional behavior, and ethical conduct. But what really matters is the culture, how people behave when no one is watching. And we as auditors play a big role in that. One of our key roles as internal auditors is to encourage and promote an ethics-based culture in the organization. And that's not just about highlighting risks or writing up findings. It's about asking the right questions, whether the values that are printed on the wall are actually being lived in the day-to-day. I remember working with a client where the whistleblower policy looked great on paper, comprehensive, like everything you would expect. But when we started speaking to staff, there was a hesitation. People weren't sure if it was safe to speak up. So it turns out that the last person who raised an issue quietly left the company a few months later. So the question wasn't about whether there was a policy, it was about whether there was trust in the process. And that's the kind of thing we need to uncover as internal auditors. Now, one shift with these new standards I think is really important is that they go further than before. Right, the IA Code of Ethics told us to respect and contribute to the organization's ethical objectives. But standard 1.2 pushes us to report behavior that doesn't align with those ethical expectations. And that's a big step. It means we can't just notice things and file them away. We have a duty to act. And of course, how we act depends on organizations, policies, and procedures. And if we are seeing if we see something concerning, we need to follow the right process, right? So you see something, right? And that's why it's so important for us to understand the methodology the chief audit executive has established, because that's our playbook as internal auditors.